All right, hello grade 11s. So today's lesson is about sandy shores. So on this slide here, you can see that we've obviously got some sand of different particle size. So I just thought it was interesting to show you that all of these sand grains were collected at the same beach. So it shows you the difference in the weathering of the sand grains. And also this is just another reminder from grade 10 about marine sediments and what they're made up of. So they're obviously made from rocks and soil, but you can also see that they are made up from broken pieces of shell. Alright, so just as our rocky shore, our sandy shore is also split into our three zones, our upper, our middle, and our lower zone. So the upper shore, you can see it's pretty dry. There isn't that much, there's no wet sand there, so the waves aren't really going up there at this time of the month. Our middle zone has a mixture, and then our lower zone is like permanently wet. Alright. And then we also just have some marine birds around, so it's just important to note that marine birds form part of the biotic stresses of this environment, as they are predators to most of the organisms that are living within the sand. Alright, so for this lesson, you're going to need the Sandy Shore Exploration notes. So you have these in your little term 4 pack. So I'm just going to go through this with you, and we're going to fill it in together, so you fill it in on your side as we go through the lesson. Alright, so it says here, large sections of the South African coastline have sandy shores where sand overlies the coastal bedrock, also known as beaches. These shores are also thriving ecosystems, but not as obviously as rocky shores. Alright, so we spoke about that in class. They are thriving. We can't see all the animals because the animals are in the sand. Alright, so starting off with our abiotic factors, which are our non-living factors. The first one that the animals would need to be prepared for is unstable sand. Alright, so why is the sand unstable? Because it has sand particles that are constantly in motion owing to the wave action. Alright, so there you can just fill in your wave action. Alright, so you can imagine that if you're burrowing into the sand and the sand is unstable, your burrow is going to need to be very well adapted, and you have to be a very good builder of your burrow. Alright, moving on down here, it says, consequently, beaches provide no permanent or hard substrate for organisms to attach themselves to, so therefore they protect themselves by burrowing into the sand for protection. Okay, so these are an example of different animals that burrow and how they would burrow. So firstly, in a sheltered environment where there's not that many wave actions, then the animals create tubes with small particles of sand. One example of this is the tangleworm. So the tangleworm was something we looked at in term 1 when we did annelids. So here you can see the worm itself is sitting here in its tube, and all of these tentacles that are going out of here, those are its feeding tentacles. And the feeding tentacles are lying just on top of the sand, and so as soon as it gets something into its tentacle, it will move it in towards its mouth in the center. Then on the other side of things, we have turbulent environments. So turbulent environments, there's a lot of movement happening. So the water and the sand will be constantly moving. And in this situation, the animals actually need to push between the sand particles. Alright, they can't just sit there because otherwise the turbulent waters would move them around. So they basically have to have muscles, and they have to be strong to attach. Just a note on finer and coarse sand particles. Your finer sand grains are going to be your very, very, very small sand grains, and your coarse sand grains are going to be bigger, and they're going to have bigger gaps in between them compared to the fine particles that are all on top of each other. Alright, so an example of this, of an animal that actually has muscles, would be the white mussel. Please note the difference in the spelling there. Okay, so white mussels, as you can see here in step A, they open up their shell, they drop their foot outside of their shell into the sand, which you can see here by B. And then when their foot is dropped in, they push their muscles in their foot outwards to kind of steady themselves in that position. And then they close their shells up at the top, and they can actually sink and pull themselves deeper into the sand. Basically, what you need to know is that they have muscles and they can hold themselves in place so they don't get moved around by all this turbulent water. Alright, the second abartic factor, so remember the first one here was unstable sand, the second one is wave action. So the size and the amount of waves that we have will determine whether beaches are eroded or built up. Alright, so we did speak about this in the previous lesson, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Alright, let's look at number 3. Remember, we are still busy with abartic factors. Alright, so the gradient of the slope, which basically means how steep is your slope. The gradient can either be short and steep, or it's going to be long and shallow. So what a short steep slope looks like is something like this. Short and steep, there's your water, and a long and shallow gradient would maybe look something like this, with your water like that. Alright, so when we are looking at our short steep gradients, we are going to have a high energy. So when we're talking about energy, we're talking about the waves specifically. So that means that these waves would come in and they would break on the shore with a lot of energy. These ones will be low energy waves because as they come up onto the shore, they'll simply just spill over. They won't have these big plunging waves. Okay. Alright, you can leave out the waves and the currents for now. And then you can just make yourself a note that your sand grains over here on your short steep slope will be larger, and on your long shallow gradient you'll have finer sediment. So if we're going to link that to the previous one, your coarse grains here will have your mussels living here because there's lots of turbulent water, and on the long shallow side you are going to have your tangled worms. Okay, and it's not turbulent there, it is more gentle. I don't remember the term we used on the previous page, but there you go. Okay, alright, so we have done unstable sand, we've done wave action, and we have done gradient. Alright, the last one for abartic is available oxygen. Okay, so for this one, the coarse sand drains the water and allows for air to penetrate. Very fine sand retains, so retains means hold, so it holds onto the moisture, but it excludes oxygen. Okay, so if I was you, I would highlight fine sand excludes oxygen. So what this then does is it will trap organic material. That organic material will be broken down by bacteria, and remember that it will be broken down by anaerobic bacteria because there is no oxygen in there. Okay, and then lastly, this releases hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide also stinks, so when you're on the beach and you have some stinky sand, then you'll know, okay, this sand has no oxygen in it, and it has hydrogen sulfide in it. Why does it have no oxygen and hydrogen sulfide? Because it's very, very fine sand, and all the organic material in that fine sand has been broken down to release the hydrogen sulfide. Alright, and then you have a little question here that says, what color is anaerobic sand? So the answer to that is black. Sometimes it can look gray. Alright, so before we go up to the biotic factors, Okay, we kind of already spoke about predation anyway. But before we go to that, I just want to show you some photos of the black and the grey sand. Okay, so here this picture, you can see that it says black sand is typical of an anoxic sediment, so where there's no oxygen. So here it doesn't look so much black, but it's kind of like a grey color, which is quite obvious against the brown of the sediment. And then on the picture on the right here, you can see there's a little hole as well of where that animal burrowed. And as it burrowed, it pushed the sand out, creating this black sand heap. Okay, so for our biotic factors, other than our predators and whatnot, the main thing we need to know about sandy shores is this nutrient cycling and meiofaunal food chain. So this is very important. So you guys can have a read through here basically on your notes. I'm going to go to the slides. I'm going to show you some photos of some animals of the sandy shore, how they feed, how they move, and then basically we'll come back here to this 1, 2, 3 step, because this is incredibly important for your exams, and then we'll go through the example here at the bottom. Okay, so remember here that you've got your upper, your middle, and your lower zones of your sandy beach. So starting at the upper zone, here we usually find a lot of kelp that is washed up onto the beach. So this is Muizenberg Beach. This kelp is a very, very important food source for a lot of animals that are living here. Mostly animals like pill bugs or sandhoppers. I would suggest that you guys go have a look at what pill bugs and marine sandhoppers look like. And they will also form part of this meiofaunal food chain that we're going to look at in a minute. Alright, then in our low to middle shore, this is some of the animals that we find. So we've already seen our white mussel. We've seen how the white mussel burrows and digs into the sand, but we haven't looked at our scavengers, which are, the example we have here in Muizenberg is a plough shell. So the plough shell is a type of whelk. It's a carnivore, in this case obviously a scavenger, scavenging for the white mussel. And in this image over here, the plough shells are scavenging off of a jellyfish that has washed up on Muizenberg Beach. Okay, so here's a video, show nice video, how they're feeding this. So these are your plough shells, yeah, eating a crab on the inside there.
Probably correct with this one. So these are little people. You little guy.
What are we, David Attenborough now? Okay, so here you can see that's how the plough shell moves. You can see its muscular foot, and in the front of it has this little, but it's sensing the direction it needs to go to. It's food, and there you can also see close to the crab, goes inside. Other plough shells that are burrowing and digging into the sediment. So everyone's gone now. So that's plough shells. On their big muscular foot that you saw, they use that muscular foot to surf the waves. So they will take the waves and surf up the beach. They'll scavenge off on the middle to upper shore, and then they'll surf the waves back to the lower shores again, or they will simply burrow themselves away from the sun. Okay, right, and then part of your meiofaunal food chain and your nutrients is sea foam. So sea foam is a very important source of nutrients on sandy shores, and most of it comes from kelp that has washed up. So here you can see some slimy sea foam, and you can imagine how much nutrients that would go into the sand to all the animals that are living in the sand food chain. And just have a look at this step by step. Alright, so we've seen the images. Now this is very important. This is not part of the macrofaunal food chain. So the macrofaunal would be your larger animals. So an example of this on the sandy shore would be your plough shells. Okay, they are big, we can see them. They are considered macro. Right. Then we also have obviously your microfaunal food chain, your plankton and things like that. That's not too small. So meiofaunal is that sweet spot in the middle between micro and macro. Alright, so step number 1, we have bacteria. bacteria breaks down the organic particles to release nutrients. All right. Then step number 2, that bacteria-covered particles becomes food for protists and worms. So essentially those nutrients that are released from the bacteria breaking down organic particles, that becomes food, right? Remember, protists and worms, those will be part of your meiofaunal food chain. All right, back here, number 1, the bacteria break down organic particles. Remember that they could be breaking down kelp, or they're like little tiny pieces of kelp. Or you can think of the sea foam even, the sea foam. Very small things. All right, and then these protists and worms, they then go eat those nutrients. And then at step number 3, those protists and worms, they will release feces and waste. And that feces and waste will be broken down further by more bacteria. And then again, the cycle continues. That bacteria will release nutrients, will go back into the sand, and then that will become food for phytoplankton. All right, so the key players in this meiofaunal food chain are the bacteria, that's breaking down organic material to release nutrients. Then we have protists and worms that take those nutrients and release feces and wastes. Then we have bacteria again that releases more nutrients, and those nutrients will then go to phytoplankton. All right, cool. An example of this for the West Coast, we're going to have a look at that now. So we have our organic particles like kelp that's washed up on the shore. Then remember, we've got our macrofauna, our larger animals, sandhoppers and pearl bugs. They will then feed on that seaweed. Right, and then again, those pearl bugs will release smaller particles and feces, which become part of the meiofaunal food chain, meaning the bacteria get a hold of it again to release more nutrients. Okay. All right, and then we spoke about the nutrient-rich foam and etc. All right, guys, so that is sandy shores. That is part of your grade 12 topic. When we go to the beach on Wednesday for your outing, you need to be comfortable with all of these things. So basically, if you go... Alright, and then I've just added the slide here because this is just a reminder of what your objectives are for the lesson. You need to be comfortable with both your abiotic and your biotic factors that affect sandy populations. So abiotic being your unstable sand, your wave action, your gradient, and your oxygen. And your biotic factors being the food, the predators, the type of animals that are there. And then for point 10, you need to know the commonly found beach animals and their adaptations and behaviors. So you need to know about your tangleworms, you need to know about your mussels, how do they burrow, how do they dig into the soil. Your plow shells, you've got to describe how they surf up to the beach, what do they eat, how do they eat, where do they eat, how do they get back, how do they burrow, why do they burrow, all of those things. And then lastly, your meiofaunal food chain. So you need to be able to describe how sandy beaches assist in cycling nutrients in the ocean. All right, cool. See you soon.